Hi, I'm Jamie, and I like to draw and paint things. Today, I'm going to show you how I drew Withered Golden Freddy here. This is my first Five Nights at Freddy's fan art, so whether you're a fan of Five Nights at Freddy's, you're a fan of artwork, or you're just looking for a couple tips and tricks, please consider giving me a like, hit me with a subscribe. I post weekly content. Now, what you're going to need is a pencil to do your original sketch, some pens to line your work, an eraser. This is a kneaded eraser. You don't have to have one of these. You're going to need alcohol markers, lots of shades of browns, yellows, and greens for this guy. Probably most importantly, gray. Now, gray alcohol markers are going to be used a lot in this to make it look less shiny and vibrant. You want it to have a real withered, dilapidated, nasty look. And finally, the last tool we'll be using is a white gel pen. We can use this to bring out the highlights on the wires, to add little highlights to the nose, to the hat, everywhere that needs to be brought back to white. Anyway, let's get right to it. For this piece, I'm dividing my paper. I'm giving myself a little horizon line and a center line. And then after that, we're looking for the basic shapes. In this case, Golden Freddy. His body is very much just a large square. His legs are mostly just rectangles. One's kind of kicked over to the side. Keeping everything in simple shapes when you're doing the sketching process. I'm not spending time on detail here. The only thing I'm worrying about is how much space is the character going to occupy on my page, and do I have enough room? Have you ever drawn something and then you did a great job on the face and the head, and then you suddenly realize that the shoulder, the neck, the arm, something like that runs off the page? Doing this little step right here will really help you with your proportions and help you keep things on the page. As you can see, I'm not putting detail in. We've got upper arms, we've got forearms, we've got vague hand shapes, but everything is basically squares, circles, triangles, rectangles. Now, as I work through the piece and as we discover where things are going to be living, we get a little bit more detailed. So here I start laying in his snout, his nose, his eyes. The eyes are just large squares, a little bit rounded. He's got some wires hanging out of one side. Eyebrow placement is important. And with Freddy, the ears and the little connector to the ears is super important. The hat is off kilter just a little bit. The mouth is hanging wide open, and he's got his very large, some sort of goofy teeth peeking out of the top and all along the bottom. The ear is just wires, and now it's time to ink. So our pencil sketch is right. We've got a lot of extra lines, a lot of what we call construction lines showing. Now this is the part where you make the big decisions. Which lines are going to be permanent and which lines are going to get erased. Be very careful when you're lining small things like the wires. Give yourself enough room to put color inside the wires. Work your way around the whole piece. In some ways, this is the most relaxing part of the process. You've done the hard work now. It's just a matter of drawing the lines where they go. Keep your line quality the same. That means don't have a lot of thick lines and a lot of super thin lines at this stage. Later on, that line weight can be used to emphasize and de-emphasize a few things. But for now, we're just trying to get our line work finished so we can erase our pencil and we can start coloring. Once we erase the pencil, that will reduce the blackness of our liner here. I'm using a micron fine liner, a 0.05 size. This is pretty good quality India ink. It's very fast. It doesn't smudge with alcohol markers, but it will lose a little bit of its blackness when we erase. So one of the steps we'll do later on is to go back over some of these black lines that we want to show up. Some of them are going to be okay if they fade into the background. This is a nitty and gritty kind of scene. He's an old animatronic. He's got wires and pieces hanging out. Here's the eraser. I'm using a kneaded eraser. You don't have to use that. Don't use the pink eraser from the back of your pencil though. Now it's time for the black. I'm using a chisel tip Sharpie here because it's what I have on hand, and I'm coloring in those places that I know are going to be totally black. Inside the eyes, the nose, the eyebrows, inside the mouth. Now, if you don't have a white gel pen that I showed in the beginning, be careful with doing your black. I'm a little more reckless here because I'm not worried about losing highlights. I know I can take my white gel pen or a white colored pencil and bring some of those highlights back into existence if they get lost during the coloring process. So we're adding the different holes throughout the animatronic with the hard black. It looks very jarring right now, but once we get enough color on there and enough value to make him really, really darker, it'll all make sense then. We're going to go ahead and give him a little bit of like a cast shadow where he's sitting on the ground. We will eventually color the entire background in black, but for now, the floor is just enough. Looking very, very carefully at my reference picture, I noticed that some of his highlight colors are green. So I'm using sort of a lime green here just to give myself a little accent. Much of this is going to be covered in shades of yellows, browns, and grays, but if you can get a little extra layer of color through there, it will help pay off. Going straight from the green into one of the darker shades. This is a burnt umber. This is, I think it's number 102 in Hobby Lobby's markers. I don't know what it is in Copic. Sorry, I don't have Copics. But this is what I use, Hobby Lobby's Master Touch brush alcohol markers. Paying attention to my reference. He's just really dirty. He's really nasty. So we're being really, really loose. We're just kind of leaving all these squiggles around. It's supposed to look awful right now. And that gives me a point to bring up. Your art is going to go through phases. Every single drawing that I do goes through ugly phases, and it goes through beautiful phases. And it goes through phases where sometimes I'm looking at it thinking, what am I doing? How am I an artist? I'm crazy. There's no way this is going to work. But it's always important whenever those little nagging thoughts show up to trust yourself and to trust your process and just keep working. Just keep working. Now we've got a lighter shade of brown here, filling in some of the more mid-tone areas that are up against the dark, dirty browns, giving it a little bit more of a yellow hue, but still really just building up the dark and dirty areas. These aren't the areas that are going to be the lightest lights, but they're also not going to be the darkest darks. Alcohol markers and acrylic paints, particularly, and oil paints, are all about building up layers of colors. If you just do one color, your piece is going to look very flat. And if you just want it to look flat, that's totally fine. But I'm going for a more Five Nights at Freddy's kind of style. So I'm really going for it. I'm really laying on a lot of different shades here. Now, it's all kind of turning muddy, so I want to bring it all together so I can do a better job of explaining this to you. So I'm going over all of these places with a lemon yellow. This, again, is not the right color. This is not the finished color, but it is probably the brightest shade that's going to be on his body. I'm coloring right over top of all of those browns. Now, because these are alcohol markers, they're going to mix. They don't absorb the colors underneath them the way that water-based markers do. This is how they're meant to be used. We've got some warm spots. I've got a little bit of a pink here, just bringing some highlights into it. And now we're going to start working on the teeth. This is a blue-gray shade. Metallic pieces are usually okay to use blue grays and warm grays. Blue gray is better than warm gray. Cool gray is what I meant to say. Blue gray and cool gray. Here is a darker gray. This is not black. I think this is a blue-gray number 7. And I'm using this to add some of the deeper shadows, some of the deeper tones that aren't quite black, but are still very, very dark. The more we layer up these, the more depth we're creating. So we've got to trick the eye into thinking that a flat two-dimensional space contains a 3D object. So we do that by manipulating the value. That's the shades of tones on it. This is just the beginning. I'm going to come through here soon with cool grays 3, 5, here we go, and start really, really going over top of things. Now we're working on the cast shadow from the legs, the cast shadow from the chin, all around the eyes, underneath the hat, anywhere we can get things to be knocked down just a little bit. They're too bright right now. Everything is far too bright. Everywhere the light doesn't hit needs to be touched with this gray to make it more dull. Think Tim Burton kind of style. You want it washed out looking. Reaching back for the black, coloring in around the ankles, leaving the little metal pieces exposed, just plain white paper for now. Those are all going to get shades of gray. Here's the white gel pen coming into play. We've added some highlights to the nose, highlights to the mouth, highlights to the hat, and to the wires coming out of his head. Now we've reached the point where we need to see how dark are we going to go. So we're going to add a solid black background all around the figure. This is going to really tell us how much more darker do we need the piece. Right now it looks okay because he's sitting on white paper. After his background is turned black, it may not stand out as much as I'm wanting it to. So we may have to do some more work, some more shadows, and some more highlights. It's easy to take your pieces and go darker. It is much more difficult to make a piece lighter. So keep that in mind as you're using your colors. Don't always go from darkest to lightest, because sometimes you'll paint yourself into a corner and not have enough flexibility. So like I said before, I had accounted for this. I knew I had my white gel pen, so I wasn't worried about losing these wires. I could draw them back in, and that'll actually make them look a little bit more mysterious, like you're just getting a hint of the wire instead of the wire being so prominent in the piece. He's nearly finished. We've got some white pastels and some red pastels and some blue pastel pencils. We're just adding some different colors to the wires. I went ahead and signed it, but then I realized I wasn't finished. I grabbed my Micron fine liner. This is a 005, a very, very small tip. And I go through and add these little tiny squiggles all over the animatronic. This is really going to help it look gritty. Help give it that more than just a color texture, but an actual texture. Oh, my camera is having trouble focusing on both my fingertips and where the pen head is. But I'm going to cover the majority of the animatronic with just these little tiny squiggles. There's no rhyme or reason to them. They're just the pen bouncing all around the paper. You could really coat, and I did Springtrap this way. I coated all of Springtrap with these little bitty squiggles. Now, granted, Springtrap is a pretty nasty, I don't want to say animatronic suit, but he's a pretty nasty suit. I'd say Withered Golden Freddy is probably just as nasty. But I did this one before, so I've learned a lot about squiggles since then, so I can pass that information on to you guys. Little tiny squiggles. Don't use your big fat Sharpies because you will ruin your piece. This is a very, very thin liner. 0.005. That's very, very small. I'm adding these to the darkest of dark areas and using them to try to bridge the gap between the darks and the lighter shades. And here you have it, Withered Golden Freddy. Let me tilt it out of the light so you lose a little bit of the glare. Check out the microphone, the ankles, the knees, the cool cast shadow going across the belly. There's my signature right there. I almost wrote 22, but I recovered to 23. And there he is. Let me know what you guys think.